The lanterns burned low along the edge of the Hathaway plantation, their flames trembling as if afraid to shine too brightly. Beyond them stretched the thick woods, an old, breathing thing that locals claimed had a voice of its own. Most people refused to wander near it after sundown, but the twins, Ilara and Evangeline Hathaway, had never feared what lay in the dark. They grew up listening to its murmurings, convinced that the whispers drifting through the branches were meant only for them. Some nights, when the wind was still, the forest would hush completely, and the girls would swear they heard their names spoken from somewhere deep inside the trees. By 1852, the whispers had grown louder, more impatient, almost pleading, especially after the strange death of their mother. Everyone on the plantation believed the twins carried some of their mother's madness, but no one dared say it aloud. They moved through the halls like reflections of each other, calm, elegant, and unsettlingly silent, as though the world around them was merely a distraction from whatever secrets they shared. Yet even they sensed a shift the day two enslaved brothers, Jonas and Micah, were brought to the estate. The moment the twins saw them, the woods stirred violently, and the brothers admitted later that the forest seemed to speak too, muttering warnings neither of them understood. The nights grew heavier. Shadows lengthened in ways the moonlight couldn't explain. The twins often slipped into the woods after dusk with the brothers following, drawn by something older and darker than desire. They found abandoned shacks, markings in the soil, and symbols carved into trees that matched those in their mother's hidden journal. Each discovery seemed to tighten the noose of an unseen fate around their throats. And the deeper they ventured, the stronger the whispers became, no longer soft, no longer distant, but urgent and commanding. When the storm arrived one thunder-soaked evening, the voices finally spoke clearly. A pact had been left unfinished, and the bloodline demanded a price. The twins understood then that the path ahead would not lead them back home. What waited in the woods was older than their family name, older than the plantation itself, and it had been waiting for them, calling them, since the day they were born. The unsettling bond between Ilara and Evangeline began long before anyone on the Hathaway plantation truly noticed it, but by the time the twins turned 18, the connection had grown into something that drifted far beyond simple sisterhood. They spoke in half-finished sentences the other somehow understood, moved with mirrored gestures, and often vanished for hours without explanation. Most whispered that twins naturally shared strange instincts, yet there was something different, something sharper, uncanny, and almost possessive, about the way these two clung to each other as though the world beyond their shared orbit was irrelevant. Their childhood had been marked by odd behaviors, waking in the middle of the night to stand silently at their window, walking hand in hand into the woods before sunrise, returning with mud-streaked dresses and faraway looks in their eyes. When questioned, they simply said the woods liked to talk to them. No one believed it, of course, dismissing the stories as childish imagination, but the twins never outgrew the habit or the feeling that they were listening to something no one else could hear. As their 18th birthday approached, the twins started experiencing episodes that unsettled even the most loyal plantation workers. Servants found them sitting in the attic at dawn, staring at the wall as though listening to a conversation happening behind it. At other times, the girls would pause abruptly while walking down the hall, turning their heads in perfect unison toward the woods as if someone had called their names. They never looked frightened, only alert, as though they were waiting for instructions. The forest that bordered the estate had always been thick, ancient, and avoided, but for the twins, it felt like an extension of themselves. They spent more time among the trees than at the house, often reappearing with whispered comments about the hush before the speaking or the way the branches lean when they want to be heard, leaving others uneasy. Their bond, once dismissed as charming or unnervingly close, took on a darker tone when their mother's health began to decline. On nights when she suffered the worst episodes of her illness, the twins would disappear into the woods and return only once the household grew quiet again. Some believed they were escaping the stress of her madness, but others noticed the pattern too closely. Whenever the mother's screams intensified, the twins vanished, only to appear later with an eerie calmness on their faces. After her death, the whispers they had claimed to hear became more persistent, filling the air with a presence that only they seemed able to sense. It was as if their 18th year awakened something long dormant, a force that had waited patiently for them to reach an age where innocence faded and purpose could take shape. The discovery of their mother's hidden journal came not through curiosity but through accident, though the twins would later insist that the book had been waiting for them all along. It happened on a warm afternoon when the attic windows rattled without any hint of wind, as if something inside the house shifted restlessly. Ilara noticed a loose floorboard trembling under her step, and when she knelt to pry it open, both she and Evangeline felt a chill that seemed to rise from the very cracks of the wood. Within the hollow space lay a single object wrapped in faded linen, their mother's journal, bound in dark leather and marked with scratches that looked less like wear and more like warnings carved by a shaking hand. They had never known her to keep a diary, and yet the moment they touched it, they felt a strange familiarity, as though the words inside had been whispered to them long before they knew how to listen. The journal's contents were nothing like the genteel reflections a plantation lady might record. Its pages held frantic sketches of twisted trees, symbols shaped like binding knots, and scattered entries that hinted at a presence in the woods that watched, followed, and sometimes even answered. Their mother wrote about nights when she heard footsteps outside her window despite everyone being asleep, and mornings when the forest seemed to rearrange itself, offering pathways that hadn't existed the day before. She spoke of the twins too, calling them her shadows of fate, and noting moments when they wandered into the trees without waking her, returning with dirt beneath their nails and a strange glow in their eyes. She feared they were being guided by something she herself had once tried to escape. Most unsettling was a repeated phrase appearing throughout the journal in hurried, trembling lines: the pact binds blood and shadow, and the last daughters must pay what was promised. Neither twin knew what the pact referred to, but the dread in their mother's handwriting carried the weight of something ancient and dangerous. Another entry described a night when she tried to burn the journal, only for the flames to flicker and extinguish themselves as though suffocated by an unseen force. She wrote of hearing voices in the dark, voices that grew louder during her pregnancy, voices that fell silent the moment the twins were born, as if satisfied with their arrival. Reading the journal, the twins felt a mixture of fear and recognition, sensing that the warnings were not about what might come but what had already begun. Each page seemed to echo the strange instincts they had carried their entire lives, confirming that their bond with the woods was not imagined but inherited, a legacy rooted not in nature or superstition but in a promise their bloodline had made long before they ever breathed. The arrival of the enslaved brothers, Jonas and Micah, unsettled the plantation in a way no one could quite articulate, but the twins felt the shift immediately, like a tremor running beneath the soil. They first saw the brothers as they were being led through the courtyard, their expressions stern but alert, their eyes flicking toward the woods the same way the twins often did. It was that glance, quick, instinctive, and tinged with a strange recognition, that froze Ilara and Evangeline in place. Most new arrivals looked at the forest with fear or suspicion, yet these brothers regarded it as though they already knew its secrets, or worse, as though it already knew them. When the wind stirred the treetops, the twins noticed the brothers tense, not from intimidation but from something closer to acknowledgement, as if answering a familiar call. Within days, rumors began to spread among the workers. Jonas had woken in the middle of the night claiming he heard someone whispering outside his cabin door, though no footsteps had been found in the dirt. Micah was seen lingering near the tree lean at dawn, staring into the darkness between the trunks with an expression that was neither fear nor curiosity, but a grim sort of understanding. When questioned, he simply muttered that the woods talked too much here, a comment that drew uneasy glances from those who had grown up avoiding the forest at all costs. The overseer dismissed their behavior as exhaustion, but the twins felt something deeper brewing, something that mirrored their own experiences in ways they couldn't ignore. The first time the four of them crossed paths alone, the air shifted sharply, almost painfully, like a note played too close to the ear. The twins were returning from one of their silent walks in the woods when they encountered Jonas and Micah gathering fallen branches near the edge of the trees. Without any greeting, Jonas looked past the twins into the forest and whispered, "It's louder today," a remark that made the girls' hearts stop. No one else ever spoke of the forest that way, no one else ever admitted hearing what they heard in the quiet moments between the rustling leaves. Ilara stepped closer, her voice low as she asked what exactly he meant, and Jonas hesitated before saying they had heard murmurs the night before, soft but distinct, carrying their names in a voice that wasn't human. The twins felt no surprise, only certainty. The connection the brothers shared with the woods seemed less like coincidence and more like design, as though the forest itself had drawn them to the plantation. In their presence, the whispers grew stronger, the air thicker, and the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lurked beyond the tree lean felt dangerously thin. The twins realized then that Jonas and Micah were not outsiders to their haunting, they were part of it, bound by the same unseen force that had shaped the twins' lives since birth. The forbidden relationship between the twins and the enslaved brothers did not begin with longing or stolen glances but with an unspoken recognition that unsettled all four of them. It started in small, quiet moments, Jonas pausing mid-task when he felt Ilara's eyes on him, Micah turning his head just as Evangeline stepped into the room, the twins appearing near the cabins at dusk with no explanation for why they had wandered so far from the house. None of them sought closeness at first, yet they kept finding themselves drawn into the same spaces, pulled together by a force that felt older than choice. What should have been innocent encounters gradually thickened with tension, not the simple spark of attraction but a deeper entanglement rooted in the whispers that hovered around them like a persistent shadow. Every time the wind stirred the trees, each pair felt the woods urging them toward each other, as though the forest recognized something between them before they did. One evening, as the sun bled orange against the treetops, Ilara found Jonas standing alone near the tree line, his hands trembling slightly as he whispered that the voices had spoken his name again. Instead of fear, she felt a strange clarity, stepping closer until the space between them felt charged, almost humming. Jonas admitted he sensed her presence even when she was nowhere near, as if a thread pulled tight between them. Ilara confessed she felt it too. Their closeness didn't feel like a decision but like surrendering to something that had already woven their fates together. Evangeline and Micah experienced a similar pull, Micah once waking in the middle of the night certain Evangeline was calling him, only to find her standing outside his cabin moments later with no memory of how she got there. Their connection deepened quickly, quietly, and dangerously, strengthened not by romance but by a shared haunting that refused to loosen its grip. What made their growing bond dangerous was not only the strict social order that forbade such relationships but the intensity with which the woods seemed to encourage it. Whenever the couples stood too close, the forest grew unnaturally still. Whenever they pulled away out of fear or reason, the woods seemed to groan in protest, sending gusts of wind or muffled whispers through the branches. It felt as though they were pieces in a ritual they did not yet understand, fulfilling steps that had been written long before their births. The more they fought the attraction, the more unbearable the whispers became, turning nights into sleepless hours filled with murmured commands and strange dreams of shadowy ceremonies in the trees. Eventually, resisting became impossible. They found comfort in each other not because they were free to choose it but because something in the darkness insisted they were meant to be joined. And beneath the closeness, beneath the stolen moments and whispered confessions, a deeper truth lingered. Their forbidden bonds were not the cause of the haunting but a requirement, a step toward a purpose none of them had yet uncovered. The discovery of the secret shack in the woods happened on a morning when the fog lay so thick across the ground that the twins and the brothers could barely see the path beneath their feet. The forest had been restless for days, its whispers sharper and more urgent, guiding them deeper than they had ever ventured before. Jonas insisted he had seen a flicker of firelight the night before, a dim, pulsing glow that vanished as soon as he approached. Micah claimed he heard someone humming in a woman's voice, a melody he couldn't place but felt he had known all his life. The twins, driven by a mixture of dread and certainty, led the way, following a trail that seemed to appear only as they stepped forward, the branches parting like skeletal hands pointing them onward. After nearly an hour of walking, the fog thinned just enough for them to make out the outline of a small, crooked structure tucked between two massive oaks, its roof sagging, its walls covered in moss, as though the forest had tried swallowing it whole. The shack was older than the plantation house, older than any recorded history of the land. No one had mentioned it before, yet the moment the twins saw it, something deep within them stirred with recognition. The door hung half open, creaking as though it breathed. Inside, the air was cold despite the heat of the season, and the floorboards groaned like they carried memories of every footstep that had ever crossed them. On the back wall, carved into the wood, were symbols identical to those in their mother's journal, twisting loops, intersecting lines, and the same knot-like shapes meant to represent binding. Some were etched lightly, others cut so deep the grooves still glistened as if freshly carved. Jonas brushed his fingers across one and immediately recoiled, swearing the wood felt warm like living skin. But the discovery that chilled them most was the blood-stained wedding veil draped over a rusted hook near the corner. It appeared old, yellowed, torn at the edge, but the dark stains along the lace were unmistakably recent, as though someone had worn it only days before. Evangeline reached for it but froze when she felt a faint vibration beneath her fingertips, almost like a heartbeat pulsing through the cloth. Next to the veil lay a small wooden box, inside which they found dried flowers, a ring carved from bone, and a folded scrap of parchment bearing a single sentence written in a hurried hand: "The pact demands the joining, and the forest will witness." The shack felt less like a hiding place and more like an altar abandoned in haste, a place where rituals had once been performed and perhaps never truly ended. Every symbol, every object, every whispering draft of air hinted that their mother had come here before them, that the pact she wrote about in her journal had roots reaching deep into this forgotten structure. And as the four stood there, the forest outside grew unbearably silent, as if holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. The truth of the pact revealed itself slowly, like a shadow forming shape by shape in the dim corners of the twins' minds, yet when it finally settled, it felt as though it had always been there, waiting for them to notice. After discovering the shack, the twins pored over their mother's journal for clues, and every reread sharpened meanings they had previously overlooked. Her frantic sketches, her repeated warnings, her trembling handwriting, all of it pointed toward a ritual that had been made generations before, a binding forged in desperation by their ancestors. The journal spoke of a darkness that haunted the family line, a presence that whispered to the unborn, watched over the living, and waited beside the dying bed, always waiting for something it had been promised but never received. Their mother wrote of how the pact had been meant to protect the land and the bloodline, but its cost had been terrible. Each generation was expected to make an offering, a joining of shadow and flesh, though she never explained what form that joining should take. Instead, she hinted that the failure to complete it would unleash a hunger that would not be silenced again. The twins began noticing how the whispers changed after their discovery. The voices no longer drifted softly through the branches but pressed urgently into their minds, murmuring in fragments that felt like instructions. The forest seemed to pulse with intention, its paths shifting to steer them toward places they had never dared explore. Jonas and Micah felt the pull as well, admitting that the dreams haunting their nights had grown more vivid, filled with faceless figures chanting in languages older than memory. One dream kept repeating for all four of them, a ceremony performed beneath a canopy of twisting branches, their shadows merging while the forest watched in solemn silence. The meaning grew clearer every time they awoke gasping for breath. The pact required a joining, marriage, not for love or companionship, but to bind the living to the whispering force that claimed dominion over their bloodlines. What unsettled them most was the realization that the pact demanded the union not between the twins and men of their own standing, but with those who heard the same whispers, those marked by the same shadow, those chosen by the forest. Jonas and Micah, with their uncanny sensitivity to the woods and their own inexplicable connection to the twins, were not coincidences, they were part of the pact's fulfillment. The forest had drawn them here with the same inevitability that guided the twins since birth. And when the four of them stood together beneath the ancient trees, the whispers surged to a deafening clarity, speaking in a tone that felt less like a suggestion and more like a command. The pact was not a choice. It was an inheritance. It demanded completion, and the forest was growing restless with every moment they hesitated. The night of the forbidden wedding arrived as though the world itself had conspired to mark it, with a storm breaking across the plantation just as the moon disappeared behind churning clouds. The twins and the brothers moved silently through the forest, each step guided by the whispers that had grown insistent over the preceding weeks, murmuring instructions that none dared question. The wind bent the branches toward them as if pointing the way, rain soaking their clothes but failing to dampen the intensity that pulled them forward. The shack they had discovered days before now felt like an altar, a sacred space where the past and present collided, and it seemed to lean toward them, inviting and warning all at once. The air smelled of wet earth and iron, heavy with the sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with inevitability. Every leaf, every shadow seemed to tremble in response to their approach, confirming that the forest itself was a witness to what was about to occur. Inside the shack, the four positioned themselves carefully, instinct and whispered guidance dictating every movement. The twins held the bone-carved rings they had found, and the brothers grasped the blood-stained veil, the objects feeling unnervingly warm, almost alive, in their hands. The whispers grew louder, forming words that no human tongue could replicate fully but that somehow each of them understood. They repeated phrases of binding, of shadow, of vows that were not promises of love but pledges of submission to the pact. The ritual was precise, the motions deliberate, each step, each gesture, each spoken syllable performed exactly as the unseen force demanded. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside, lightning flashing through the shack's gaps, thunder vibrating the ground beneath their feet, a natural accompaniment to the unnatural purpose unfolding. As the ceremony continued, it became clear that this was no ordinary wedding. Each touch, each whispered name, seemed to fuse their beings with one another in ways beyond comprehension. The shadows along the walls lengthened unnaturally, seeming to stretch toward the couples, intertwining with their forms, and the air grew thick with the pulse of something ancient. There was no joy, no laughter, no vows of affection, only the rigid, chilling cadence of the pact being fulfilled. When the final step was performed, the forest seemed to exhale, a long shuddering release that rattled the shack and bent the trees outside as if acknowledging that the joining had occurred. Yet, even as the ceremony ended, a deep, uneasy silence fell. The storm did not dissipate, the whispers did not quiet entirely. The couples felt the weight of the pact settle upon them like a living thing, pressing against their hearts and minds. Something had been summoned, something older than the plantation, older than the forest itself, and it had accepted the ritual, but not without expectation. The completion of the wedding did not signal freedom, only the beginning of a deeper obligation, one that would haunt them as persistently and intimately as the voices that had guided them there. The morning after the forbidden wedding was unlike any dawn the plantation had ever witnessed. The storm had passed, leaving a thick mist that clung to the earth and the trees, as if the forest itself had exhaled in exhaustion after the night's events. Birds remained silent, their songs swallowed by the heavy air, and even the servants hesitated to step outside, sensing a tension they could not name. The twins and the brothers emerged from the woods together, their clothes damp, hair plastered to their faces, yet their eyes carried an unnatural calmness, a serenity that unsettled anyone who looked upon them. They walked in silence toward the plantation house, but with each step, an almost imperceptible shadow seemed to trail them, stretching and twisting in ways that no natural light should have allowed. It was subtle at first, something the edges of vision might catch, but as the morning deepened, the feeling of being watched, or followed, became impossible to ignore. The voices that had guided them through the ceremony were gone, replaced by a quiet, persistent hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was not a gentle sound but one that pressed against the inside of their skulls, like the slow vibration of a bell whose tone was too low for ordinary hearing. The twins noticed that Jonas and Micah flinched whenever the hum grew louder, their hands tightening around the objects they still carried from the ceremony, the bone-carved rings and the blood-stained veil. Each of them understood instinctively that the ritual had not fully ended, the forest, the pact, and whatever ancient force had orchestrated the wedding were not yet satisfied. The quiet morning was not relief but a warning, a reminder that the joining had been only a beginning. As they moved through the mist, subtle changes became evident. The shadows clung longer to their forms, shapes shifting with a life of their own. The underbrush seemed to part in unnatural ways, guiding their steps, and even the familiar paths of the plantation appeared unfamiliar, warped as if reality itself had bent in response to the ritual. The twins felt a creeping awareness that something unseen had begun to follow them permanently, a presence that did not tire, did not sleep, and did not forgive. Jonas and Micah expressed the same sensation, admitting that even in their cabins the previous night, the sense of being watched had persisted, the hum growing louder in the darkness. By midday, the realization settled over them like a weight, the pact had been partially fulfilled, but it had not granted freedom. Instead, it had awakened something patient and deliberate, a shadow that would move with them, wait with them, and claim what it had been promised. The forest no longer merely whispered, it lingered at the edges of their lives, a constant reminder that the night's ceremony was only the first step. The couples understood that this shadow would not relent and that its attention was not casual, nor could it be evaded. Every movement, every breath, every choice from that moment onward would be measured against the debt they had incurred, and the darkness that now followed them was only beginning to make its presence known. The final confrontation arrived unexpectedly, though in hindsight, it had been looming since the first whispered warnings in the forest. Days after the forbidden wedding, the couples began noticing subtle but undeniable changes in the world around them. The forest no longer merely followed their movements, it intruded into the plantation itself. Trees bent unnaturally toward the house, shadows lingered even in full daylight, and objects once left untouched now appeared shifted or broken, as if testing their awareness. The whispers returned, but these were no longer gentle or guiding, they carried accusation, urgency, and the cold inevitability of a debt that had yet to be satisfied. At night, the couples could feel eyes pressing against their backs, watching, waiting, and sometimes moving just beyond the edges of candlelight. Sleep became elusive, haunted by dreams of faceless figures reaching through the trees, calling their names, and reminding them of a promise they had never fully understood. The revelation came gradually, piece by piece. In the attic of the plantation house, the twins found another passage in their mother's journal that had been previously overlooked, written in a frantic, nearly illegible scrawl. It described the true nature of the pact. It was not merely about marriage or union but about the binding of souls to the forest, to a presence that demanded obedience across generations. Every attempt to ignore or resist it had been punished subtly, shaping the lives of their ancestors through misfortune, sudden illness, or untimely deaths. The ritual they had performed with Jonas and Micah had partially fulfilled the requirement, but the forest, or whatever intelligence it harbored, was not appeased. Its hunger, patient and precise, was still awake, demanding the completion of a task far beyond anything the couples had imagined. As the realization settled in, the forest seemed to close in. Branches scraped against windows, and shadows stretched into the hallways, growing darker, more defined, as though the living trees themselves had taken form. The couples understood that the pact was not content with symbolic gestures, it required complete submission, the surrender of their identities, and the permanent intertwining of their essences with the darkness that had called them from birth. Standing together in the heart of the plantation, they could feel the pressure of an unseen presence pressing from all sides, whispering their names with increasing insistence, reminding them that nothing could be undone. In that moment, clarity and terror collided. The truth was undeniable, the pact had never been about marriage or union in a conventional sense. It was a binding of souls, a transaction that demanded not only participation but understanding that they would never again walk freely in the world as they once had. The forest, patient and omnipresent, had drawn them into its design, and whatever ancient intelligence waited in the shadows would no longer be denied. The realization sank like a stone in their chests, the joining had begun, but it would only end when the debt was fully claimed, and until that day, the shadows would never leave, the whispers would never cease, and the price of the forbidden pact would hang over them relentlessly, shaping every heartbeat and every choice they would ever make.